And Joe Frank did that. And despite the fact that very few people thought he had a chance, he won. The first of 9 terms in the legislature. So here he is, the young fellow from the country, going down to the big city as a freshman. And guess what happens? He's appointed to the Appropriations Committee, which most legislators, Carlton will tell you, except for corrections, it's the most powerful committee in the legislature. Joe Frank served there admirably, and he worked very well with the team at that time that I thought was very, very significant. George Busby was there. Zell Miller was there. Joe Frank was there. So the state at that time was in very good hands. And as the chairman of that Appropriations Committee, Joe Frank Harris became an expert on state government. He knew the departments, he knew their needs, he knew their shortcomings, he had the patience and the willingness to help them solve their problems and become more efficient. He became widely known. I can remember when, if you went to see Speaker Murphy, he would always tell you, if you're talking about a budget matter, go see Joe Frank. So he was in a very powerful position to deal with state problems, and he did it. He did it well. And then he decided to run for governor. A very wise decision, although the road probably was just as rough as the road when he ran for the State House of Representatives. He had a number of very well qualified and well-known opponents. One was Congressman Ginn, who had been an assistant to Herman Talmadge in Washington, who had been a congressman himself, who had been on the Armed Services Committee, and therefore had all the support of the military people and the government workers in the state. A very, very viable candidate. And then you had Norman Underwood. Mr. Underwood had been with Governor Busby. Governor Busby had put him on the appellate court. He left there to run for governor, and he had the support of Governor Sanders, former Governor Sanders, and you would assume Busby, although I'm not sure that that's accurate, but I would assume that at least he claimed to have the support. So another viable candidate. The 3 of them. There were others, of course, but none of them had the knowledge or the experience or the financing to run. Everybody thought that Mr. Ginn would be the front runner in that race, and he was. Most people thought that Underwood probably would be the candidate in the runoff, but he wasn't. Joe Frank Harris came from a standing of less than 5% of the polls on opening day to get in the runoff of Mr. Ginn, and then to defeat him soundly in that runoff, and go on to become governor of Georgia. Now, you know what impressed me most about Joe Frank Harris was he wasted very little time. After he took office on January 11th, I believe, in 1983, he immediately launched his programs to complete his platform. And they were very progressive and very needed, and they exist today. And we'll talk about that later on in the program, because I know that we want to hear from him some of the decisions he made in launching his campaign. He served 2 terms as governor of Georgia, both very well. He came up with the programs that we'll talk about, and he did an excellent job there. When he left the governor's office, he went back to Cartersville, back to the business world, but he took time out to become a professor at Georgia State University, and also to serve as chairman of the State Board of Regents, and to come here today. So after the break, Jeremy, we will have our conversation with the Harrises. Thank you. Well, I can think of no greater occasion than this, to have you both here. I'm particularly pleased to have Mrs. Harris. She was our first lady, a very active one. And I'm anxious to talk with her about how she liked that job, whether it's fun, or whether it was a job, whether she could sit on the sofa and eat bonbons. Yeah, to do the things that she wanted to do. Did I miss anything about your early life?
You know, you covered it embarrassingly well. It's always still a little embarrassing when you hear someone talking about some of the things that you might have involved in, some things that you accomplished or did. And it's still a humbling when you hear that, right? You covered it well, and you covered it very accurately.
Well, I'm just glad when I met you.
I'm glad I'm here.
Well, we've known each other for years, but I want to make sure that I do things politely. Should I call you Governor, Your Excellency, or can I just get by with calling you Joe Frank?
You know, I'm still Joe Frank. And even during the time I was governor, I don't think I ever in my lifetime answered the phone saying Governor Harris. There was always, this is Joe Frank. So I'm still Joe Frank.
So, and Mrs. Harris, shall I call you Mrs. Harris for First Lady? Elizabeth. It occurred to me when you said that somewhere during your first campaign, somebody tried to get you to change your name. Joe Frank Harris to Joe Harris, wasn't it?
Well, actually, it was our PR person that we hired to try to help us put together the colors for the campaign, the photographs and the brochures and all the kind of things that you have to have to run a statewide office, or for a statewide office. And he said, there's one thing that I want you to consider. And I said, well, what's that? He said, we need to change your name. And I said, well, you need to change your name. He said, well, have you ever thought about how long Joe Frank Harris is on the bumper sticker? He said, that's too long. So if you put it small enough, people aren't going to be able to see it. He said, another thing, he said, we're in the New South now. He said, that old double name connotation, it brings up things that people don't like to subconsciously think about, like Billy Bob and John Henry or whatever. And said, you need to drop that and go back to just Joe Harris. I said, well, you know, if I got to change my name to run for governor, you got to be what you are. I said, that's not what I am. And so if we can't get all that on a bumper sticker, we'll just have to put two of them together. But it managed to work out.
And that reminds me of another incident at the inauguration, where you wanted to have your inauguration on the Capitol Square, like most people had. Except I think George Busby had his inside of the auditorium. But the speaker wanted you to have it inside. And you had a little...
No, Bob, he sent me.
I know. That was going to be my question. Elizabeth bailed you out. Now, what did you do to the speaker?
The speaker, when he said his mind or something, I mean, as you know, I mean, working Carlson, he was unchangeable. I mean, that was it, and the one in between. And so he said, imagine after I was elected, he said, you may think you're going to have this inauguration outside because I indicated earlier I want to do it authentically, like it always had been happening right there at the steps of the Capitol, and then everybody comes to the Capitol like they've done in the past. And he said, the weather's always bad, it's cold. He said, I'm not going to sit out there minutes, and I'm not going to be there. And so we solicited Elizabeth, and she said that's why we just kind of stood in the water for.
I very meekly went up to the office of the speaker, and I went in there, and I guess we women have our way. And I just very nicely told him it was going to be outside. And if it was too cold for him, I just guess he wouldn't be there.
I would never have the courage to say that. So you two met at the Faith Methodist Church in Carlinville. Elizabeth's father was a pastor. Your family were attendees. And she, as I remember, was a student at LaGrange College, which meant that you didn't get to see her as often as I'm sure you'd like. But I'm sure you did some courting by phone or or something?
Well, we kept the highway busy back and forth to the park when it rains for a whole year, during our senior year. But her dad was moved to our church after her junior year, between junior and senior year. And she was in Texas working, her sister lived there, and she had a job with one of the oil companies in Texas that summer. And came home just before school started, and I had met Elizabeth and knew the family because our family were Methodist, and her family had, of course, been involved in the ministry with our paths crossed at camp meetings and things like that. And I've seen her as a little girl. Elizabeth's 4 years younger than I am, and at the time that I saw her, she was too young to try to think about anything in the future, but I knew who she was, and I hadn't seen her when after she got to her teenage years and become a senior, about to be a senior in college. And so she returned home at the end of her time in Texas. And that first Sunday, well, she came to church, and I was pretty well impressed. I was about to become an old pastor, you know, in the community. I'd already been out of college and had been home for 2 or 3 years, and so I thought, well, I better find out a little more about her. And anyway, we did, and we arranged to start dating each other, and kind of had the best of both worlds, because we went ahead and courted and married the following June, June 25th. And then that next year, the Methodist Conference, as you know, they moved the pastors around quite often. Well, her dad got moved to another assignment, and I had the best of both worlds, so I kept a pretty preacher dog and moved the in-laws out of town.
Tell us about the son diet.
Well, I don't let women tell you about son.
Well, you know, he's a graduate of the University of Georgia. And because LaGrange was off on the other end of the state, really on the western side, he would have me, and I had friends in my bring him to Atlanta, and we would meet at the sundial, Georgia Tech, and attend the football game. And then on Sunday, he'd take me back to Cartersville, and then on Sunday he'd take me back to LaGrange. But you know, there was a lot of miles in there, but that was back when those tin-foil radios were CB radios. And I guess I learned to court Joe Frank with that CB radio right there in the middle. But I did feel comforted to know that when he was going those long, dark miles from LaGrange back to Cartersville, that something was keeping him awake.
Well, he finally got the courage to ask you for your hand in marriage.
Well, my sister, too, was she saw him that first Sunday that she brought me back from Texas, and she saw him in that white Oldsmobile convertible, and she said, Elizabeth, you ought to date him. His mother and daddy probably gave him that car. Little did I know I was going to make payments on the car.
So your father was impressed with young Harris and agreed to give you away to him. Very unusual ceremony. He gave away the bride, and he walked up to the altar, and he conducted the ceremony. That's good. I've often said, and I said it again today, that I have never seen a more loving, caring couple than you two. And I mean that. Appreciate it. Now, you became First Lady, overseer of the mansion, hands full most of the time. What was it like being a First Lady?
Well, I want to make it known that Joe Frank and I have always been partners in everything. But when you assume that office, it's almost like you're assuming the whole state of Georgia on your shoulders. And he had a staff that was just as eager to please and serve the state as he was. But you know, sometimes the distance between West Paces Ferry Road and the Capitol was very long and very distinct. And so they tried to separate the two, and it really caused a wedge in there between Joe Frank and myself. Finally, after about 6 months, I had about enough, because I was overburdened with minor responsibilities of learning to manage. Really, it's like running a small hotel. And I had never hired and fired, and I really never had help all my life growing up. And so I was learning all these things, but then I didn't have him. And I really missed that. So one day he came home, and I just gave him an ultimatum. I said, every day, or I'm out of here. I got that 15 years. And so we were able to, I really felt like it was a sharing thing. And I knew his responsibilities were great, but mine too. And I think it needed to be a melting between the two, because I felt like that mansion should serve the state of Georgia, serve his interest, and really it was an economic development too, but I don't regret it all having used it that way.
So that's the problem you hit, that you find yourself in, particularly after you're elected, and then you go through the months after your election, as you know, and being around people and working with other governors, you're totally consumed by budgetary considerations, preparation of legislation that you're going to propose, all the kind of things you're going to do. It totally consumes your hours that you have, and your family suffers because you don't have time to have that sharing and compatibility in time. But you come in late at night and you're so tired, you go to bed and you have to be up early the next morning for another assignment, and your staff programs you, they want to program you 24 hours a day. I mean, you have to be able to say no, and it takes a little time to work through it, and then you have to be shocked and realize, your priorities are getting a little bit skewed, and they're not everything like they should be, and you're not giving her the kind of time that she's used to having, and she deserves too. And so she reminded me, and it didn't take one reminder. I got it all worked out. But, I guess our reason for being in politics is a little different to most people anyway. And I thought I'll share that with you because I think it's very important. Because after we married and we built in the process of completing a new home, and our son Joe just had been born, and he came a little early too, and that kind of messed up things a little bit. So that was when people came to and support and help me consider running for the General Assembly. I had no idea what was required, even if it paid anything or what kind of campaign. I just hadn't been that tied in politically. And so it was all a learning experience. And my answer to them at the time that they came is that, we would pray about it. And if that's what the Lord wanted to do, then we would consider it. Well, the reason that I made that determination that we were going to pray about it is about a year, I guess, after we were married, Elizabeth and I, our family was always active in church too, and we grew up in the church, we were very active. We decided that if the Lord hadn't already called me to preach when I was up at Asbury, and I had that opportunity, and I didn't feel that call, that we needed to rededicate our lives to whatever the Lord had in store for us, wherever He needed us to go, and whatever He needed us to do. We made that dedication. It didn't take Elizabeth very long because she was ready to do that. I was fearful. If I made that kind of commitment, and I didn't want to be in the pulpit then, I decided, well, this is my career, and I didn't want to consider that. I thought, well, the first thing that's going to happen to me if I make that commitment is I'm going to be called to the pulpit or the foreign mission field or somewhere else. And it took me a little while, but I decided, well, you can't hold back. It's almost like accepting Jesus Christ as your Savior. You've got to get it all. I mean, you can't take part of it. And so I made that commitment. And then we spent about a couple of years after that before I had an opportunity to run for the General Assembly, really just biding our time and waiting on something to happen, not knowing what the next was going to be. I look back now and I realize that my mission field was in the capital, about 42 miles from Cartersville, and it wasn't in some foreign country somewhere. But the very area that we were so fearful in participating in, going to some foreign mission field, was the area that was probably the most productive of our state. And we traveled in some 33 or 4 foreign countries, and was in Japan some 8 or 10 times when I was governor, and we brought in over 1,000 foreign companies during that time. So it was a real window of opportunity to benefit the economy of Georgia, and I feel like that looking back now that we made that commitment and then prayed about whether to get into politics and didn't feel like the door would close for that our place for public service. Same way when I ran for governor, I mean, that was an item that we prayed about for a long time. And the door never did close, and it didn't quite swing open. I mean, it was kind of cracked, and you went up on the board, and it was hard work to get there. But the good Lord has blessed us, and we've been blessed many times during our public service.
Getting back to your first race for the House of Representatives,
you faced a pretty well-oiled opponent who, you know, had a good political background, a good political machine. A lot of people were surprised that you won. Were you surprised?
Well, I guess probably should say yes, I was surprised, but then again, you felt like that you could win or you wouldn't run. But the person that I ran against, he was a very successful attorney there in Florida. He made a lot of money, had a lot of money, and he didn't have any problem spending that money in the campaign either. And so there was no way that we could match the dollars that he had and they could put in the campaign. But he was already being promoted and had a statewide office in his future, and they were looking ahead to him to run for lieutenant governor or governor himself. But the problem that he had, and the reason I was able to defeat him, was that the business community really couldn't communicate with him. I mean, he was representing Cartersville in Atlanta instead of Atlanta and Cartersville, and or vice versa. And so they didn't feel like that they had the communications and the support and the issues they were interested in. Well, that was not the issues that he was interested in. And so it provided an opportunity for me to kind of slip in there, and we were able to do that.
And you were there when the legislature declared its independence.
Yeah. Which, in looking back, I think it was the governor actually was the king of the kingdom. I mean, he appointed the Speaker of the House, and he appointed all the committee chairs. I know, and I'm glad Carlton Caldwell is here. We went to the General Assembly at the same time. Carlton had been elected to the Senate before that and didn't get to serve. And then he got reapportioned out and came back to the House and General Assembly. And I always remember, Carlton, what you had told me when we were on the way to Plains to welcome Jimmy Carter back to Georgia, and the rumor was out that I was going to run for governor. Carlton said, well, Joe Frank, I tell you, he said, if you run for governor, he said, I want to help you. He said, I'll do it either way. He said, I'll either support you or I'll be against you, whichever way you think will help you most. So, he did support it, and it helped me an awful lot. But back when we went to General Assembly, you would actually have to go to the governor and talk to him about your committee assignments in the House, because the governor was going to name the speaker, and the speaker would rubber stamp the bill, he would decide to serve on those committees. So the governor's office had a lot more power at that point than it had after the General Assembly became independent, but it's worked well, and I think it's proper and time that it did.
You were a freshman, and you were appointed to the Appropriations Committee, I think by George L. Smith.
Sloppy Floyd was chair, and kind of, I guess, strange because Sloppy was a really close personal friend to the person I defeated to make it to the General Assembly. And I was always amazed that he didn't hold any grudges against me about that, but Sloppy would have a perception that he wanted to reach back and pick up some of the younger fellows that had just arrived on the scene and give them the opportunity to be involved in the processes. And of course, my background in business, I think, made a field at the time, and he interceded on my behalf with the speaker, and which is George L. Yes, he appointed to.
Then Mr. Smith passed away, and Tom Murphy became speaker, and then he asked you to be chairman.
Well, when Sloppy, we were invited to meet with the Governor Bundy, just been elected, and we were going to meet with him on setting the revenue estimate for that year. Of course, it's the governor's responsibility, but he always tries to make the members of the General Assembly and the leadership there feel like they're important. And he would talk about, well, this is the highs and the lows and what the economic forecast is going to be, and this investment that we want to go with. What do you think about it? Well, it really didn't matter. He would choose whatever he wanted anyway, but we were there to meet with him on the revenue estimate. Well, Sloppy Floyd didn't show up that morning. He had come into Atlanta the night before, and found him dead in the hotel, and we started looking to see, well, where's Sloppy? Well, we had a kind of abbreviated meeting real quick, and then the speaker, we were across the street at a meeting with a bunch of people with the governor, and as we started back at the Capitol, he said, well, why don't you come to the speaker's office, and I want to talk to you. Well, I had just moved up to be vice chair of the appropriation committee I would have been for that year. I've been secretary for a number of years, and that was the year that I moved up to be vice chair. And he explained the situation, and he said, he always, if he's younger than he was, he called his son. He said, well, son, I think you're the person that I probably need to appoint to be the chair and take Sloppy's place. He said, we can't announce it till after the funeral, and I think his son and it wouldn't be appropriate to do that. But he said, the real reservation I got about you, he said, you're too good a fellow and to be chairman of the appropriation committee. He said, be chairman of that committee. He said, you got to be a mean SOB. He didn't say SOB. My response was, well, Mr. Speaker, I said, it's your choice. I said, if you think I can do the job, I said, I'll do the best I can, but I said, I've got to be what I am. And I said, I think I can fill my own shoes, but I would never be able to fill Sloppy's shoes. And I said, I don't want you to look at me in that light. And I said, I think you can do the job without being the mean SOB that you talked about. I think that people will understand it and will respond. I think you can do the job. And which he went ahead and provided that opportunity for me. And looking back now, it's probably the greatest learning experience that anyone could ever have to be governor of Georgia. Because I grew up with a budget from the time I was appointed to the appropriation committee, the whole total state budget, state funds, was less than $500 million. I mean, we'd never reached the first $1 billion budget. And when I became governor, well, the budget at that time was over $4 billion. And then when I left, it did $8 billion. And historically doubled almost every 7 years, or it has for the last 70, 80 years. And so we were continuing to grow, but I had a chance to, I guess, learn the basics of the appropriations process right there during the elementary stages of Georgia's starting its growth, and that was very, very helpful.
Don't you think that when you ran for governor, that people gave you that experience some merit?
Yeah, I think it was a factor because at that time the economy was declining. As you know, it kind of goes in cycles. You have several good years, and you might as well get prepared because you might have a slowdown. And we were in a slowdown period, and people were very conscious about the increases that they felt like had come and was going to be forthcoming on taxes. And looked far enough ahead, and what I really felt like, and was honest in my opinion, that we could operate state government without raising taxes, and that was part of my platform. That if I'm elected, then we're not going to have any tax raises during the next term, which we didn't have, and we was able to make it. But you know, I felt blessed too because the economy turned around, and we had double-digit growth for several years, and not only replenished the reserve funds, we had $637,000 in reserves, and should have had millions of dollars in reserves when I was elected because we've been depleted and the reserve funds have been drawn down. But we not only built the reserve fund back, but we was able to have the largest increases in teacher salaries and state employees and building and construction and libraries. We built over 140 public libraries by the government. So a lot of good things happened because of the economy generated enough money to be able to do that.
Bob, I do think during that time too, you saw Joe Frank learning something that he felt comfortable with, and people respected him. Because I'd sit out there and run 100, and people go in with their hat in their hand and wanting to ask him for something, and I think, oh no, there's no way he can ever say yes to that kind of request. But you know, he would tell them honestly exactly where they stood and what they needed to do to work that into the budget. But he would promise them great and flowery things, but he was fair with them and he was honest. And I think that's what we really, really want to go, and we really need to do.
And that's the reputation he had. You can ask anybody who served Joe Frank Harris, and they'll tell you the same thing. You know, he was honest, and he tells it like it is. Being chairman of appropriations, obviously would open up some opportunities for you to move around, speak, chamber of commerce, get known. So that's right. You did that. You did that. Then I want to ask you, when did you definitely make up your mind to run?
You know, it kind of, the process, I guess, evolved over time because back in 1981, there was a lot of support from people in the General Assembly and others around y'all consider running for governor, y'all consider running for governor. And I would tell them, well, we'll pray about it, we'll pray about it, well, we were praying about it, and then I got to thinking, well, how is my more conservative fiscal philosophy going to be something that can relate to people all over the whole state? Because I had run for representative in some of the counties in Bartow, Cherokee, Pickens, Dawson, and one time even in Gilbert County during the reapportionment, and you got scattered out over a wide area, but that was all in North Georgia. And so I decided that Elizabeth and I talked about it, I said, well, you know, I get opportunities all the time that I refuse to turn down to go to South Georgia and speak to city clubs and other gatherings, things like that. I said, maybe I ought to go ahead and start accepting some of those and just see what's out there and see what I can say will relate to what people are looking for. And during in 1981, the race actually was in 1982 that ran for office and then took office in 83. In 81, we started accepting those opportunities after the assembly ended in March that year. And between March and December, I made over 1,000 speeches. Drove myself to every one of them. I'd be back and forth up and down the state. I'd be back down on the coast, maybe tonight speaking to a group there or some convention or a civic club or something, and I'd be back to a breakfast in Atlanta the next morning. I'd drive on, I'd get back by myself. But the Lord provided safety and protection for me during that time and was able to survive and make it. But I got an appreciation for the state that I never had before. I also got a lot of offers of support from people that saying, well, I understand you may be considered to run for governor, you know, I'm going to help you. Well, I couldn't accept the contribution because I didn't have a committee and really didn't know I was going to run. We were still praying about it, trying to make a decision. And so I said, well, let me take your names. And I had a lot of names and addresses of all the people that were ready to contribute, ready to support me. And that's where I had a real awakening in politics, Bob, and you can relate to this too. Because after we finally made the decision in late 81, early 82, that we would attempt to do that and even hire a PR firm and had a few people that we were putting on staff getting ready to go. We made our first brochure and sent it out and had the return address and an envelope in there for people sending their contributions. Well, the contribution didn't come. I mean, I learned that if somebody offered you political money, you better accept it right then. But they didn't come. So we got talking about it, and I told them, I said, you know, maybe we misread this thing. Maybe this is not exactly what the Lord had in store for us, and we better go ahead and face up to reality and get back out all of it while we can, rather than to keep pushing it. And of course, at that time, we were funding the whole campaign out of my own pocket, all my gas and all the money, everything else. I mean, and putting up the retainer for the PR firms and all that. I hadn't taken anybody's contribution because I didn't have a committee until we finally formed the committee. Well, Mr. Glenn Taylor, many of you may know the name Glenn Taylor, I know Carlton does. He was in the construction business in Atlanta, back in enterprises, and a long-time member of the Natural Resources Board. And of course, I wanted the first time with that. But Mr. Taylor had a big farm in Bartow County, and we'd sold him material there. We were in the concrete business, and he'd done some construction there and renovations. And he called me up. I knew who he was, but I never had a personal relationship with him that much other than across paths. But he said, are you going to be in town on that coming Saturday? Well, Elizabeth and I already set a deadline that if something didn't happen within a 3-week period, that we were going to throw up our hands and say, well, this is it, we're going to get out. Well, that was in the 3rd week, or the 3rd week was upcoming when he called and said, if you're going to be in town on Saturday morning, I said, as long as you drop by the farm, I'm going to be up there and I can talk to you. Well, I dropped by that farm that Saturday morning, and Mr. Glenn was renovating one of the houses there, and he said, well, come on in the kitchen. Yes, I got a table and chairs, and as we get in there where it's a little more pleasant, we can talk a few minutes. Well, he went down the line, he said, I know you're trying to put a campaign together to run for governor. He said that I know the special interest groups are not going to support you. He said the liquor people are not going to support you because you don't drink. You're teetotaler. And he said the parimutuel people back then, that was very strong, so they're not going to support you because you don't believe in gambling. He went on down all the things I didn't believe in, I wasn't part of. And he said, you're going to have a hard time raising money. I said, I already know that. But he said, He said, I want to help you, and he said, Gary lived in Atlanta at the time, and he said, I've got some friends out in Tuckhead area, and he said, I want to have a fundraiser for you. Well, that's the first fundraiser anybody even offered. And he said, I've got an automobile that I had a salesman that was working for us, that he's changed jobs, and I hadn't filled that position, and said, you can use it in your campaign for a few weeks if you'd like to. And he said, the secretary that was working for him said, I just let her come on over to your office and help you in the campaign, so I'll keep paying her. And you know, I was just getting choked up and more choked up. And I'm not a very emotional person, but I couldn't hardly continue our conversation with him because it was just so real that this was the signal that the Lord had sent that you stay in that race. And it was an answer to our prayer. I went home, and my dad had just come by and took our son at the time. He was just finishing high school that year. He was senior high school, and he was taking places a lot of time. He just picked him up, and for some reason, when I came in, I said, well, what did Mr. Taylor want? What did Mr. Taylor have to say? Well, I started to tell her, and I was so emotional, I almost just broke down. And her mind went, well, Joe, our son had just left with his granddaddy, and did they have a wreck or something happened down the road? Because they were going the same way that I was coming from. And what's happened? Because she'd never seen that before. I finally got across to her that what he said, she realized the same thing I did, that this was the answer to prayer, and we need to stay in the race. Now, that didn't mean that the funds were turned on and everything started coming. I mean, it was still the exchanges we needed, and we got to another point in the campaign after I got in the runoff that it would take about 100 at that time. It takes a lot more to have it. Take about $120,000, $130,000 just to cover the state one time with one of your campaign videos or whatever. And we were in the runoff, and my campaign manager called me and he said, I understand you're going to be in that car room that's on Friday night in the first week of the runoff. He said, I've been to the bank and said, I've made arrangements for them to advance some money for the campaign. He said, you got to sign the note. And I said, well, how much is the note? He said, which is $750,000. Your banker can do that. So, that was big money back then. I mean, most of it was spent on a campaign for government, $2 billion, but spent that. And we thought, well, we could be on the primary for that much, but we'd already raised that much money and had that much in the campaign and still had to finish up the runoff. And so I came in that night with another matter of prayer that Elizabeth and I, we realized there's so many people, and we reported every dime anybody sent to us with it. You didn't have to report anything up to $100, but we reported $5, whatever. Felt like it ought to be reported, but then again, we had so many people that we didn't have big contributions, but we had the $5 and $10 and the 20s, and the big contributions were $100. And it's almost again like a religious conversion. You can't hold back part of it. I told them, I said, well, we've gone this far. And if we lose everything we've got, and I can't ever repay that $750,000, I sure didn't have that kind of net worth anyway. So I said, I'm going to the bank and sign it in the morning. Well, we still had to pray about it a little more that night and next morning. But I went down and signed it, and you know the story from then on. And things developed and worked out, but we were blessed, and I just am grateful for the opportunity that we had.
But there were so many people that came alongside of us that helped us out. And I said, if you can't have help and people that you respect that will put their confidence and their faith and the Lord in you. And we ran on a lot of people's reputation because a lot of people sent out those little postcards that we had to all their friends and saying, I recommend this. And they went all over the state. And money can't buy that kind of influence. And we just appreciated it so much because we did. We ran on the back of a lot of good people.
Something else that was always in the back of my mind, that $750,000, though, Harry Jackson, who was a senator, and Judge Harry, was mayor of Columbus, and he ran and was defeated the year that the other budget got elected, and spent a lot of his own money. And he told me, he said, now, Joe Frank, he said, you can take this advice whatever you think is worth. He said, if you're going to run for governor, and you ain't got enough people that will support you, that will raise the money for you to run, he said, if you got to put your own money in it, he said, don't do it. He said, He said, it's not worth it, it's not worth the risk. He said, don't risk your own money in this campaign. Well, when we were praying about that $750,000, I got thinking about little Harry that kept ringing out the end. He said, don't do it, don't do it.
Yeah, I never forget, Carl Sanders also told Joe Frank, he said, if you ain't got that fire in your belly, he says, don't do it.
He said, this is not the most overwhelming thing in your life that you think you got to accomplish. And he said, right in the pit of your stomach, and just gnawing, telling you got to do it. He said, don't do it. I never did that.
But I tell you what you did have. If I'm not mistaken, you had over 100 members of the Georgia General Assembly endorse you.
Yeah, we had, overwhelming support of the General Assembly taking the House.
And back in those days, the Speaker Murphy and you fellas in the House were the Democratic Party of Georgia.
Well, the Democratic Party, it had a more liberal and conservative element within the party. And we were, I guess, coming from the more conservative element even back then. And I guess it was kind of the forerunners already of what ended up being the Republican Party today. Was being generated, we didn't know it at the time, but you had to be a Democrat to be elected to anything then. Times have changed.
But with that 100 legislators as an organization, that's a pretty powerful force.
They're very helpful, yes.
All right, so you announced you're in the race, you know who your opponents are. Some pretty good fellows, good guys, they all had experience, and they all must have had it down here where you said. But what was your strategy? Did you want to carve out a position somewhere away from those people, or did you just want to go out and shake hands and win?
We felt like we had a very constructive platform that we were attempting to run on, and for fiscal responsibility and the kind of thing that all candidates always say, that you're like me, I'm going to run state government like a business. I do a class at Georgia State now, kind of undermining myself in a sense, because you can't do that. I mean, you can promise you can operate state government with the same business-like principles, but with the time delay that you have from making a decision today that I need a new piece of equipment or I need to start a new program, you got to go through the legislative process, and you're anywhere from 12 to 24 months away from having the money to be able to do it. Business will never survive that way. Business can hire and fire today, or they can go to the bank and borrow money and buy a new piece of equipment, put it on the ground, and meet their competition. And I wish state government could be a little more responsive, but then again, you lose the checks and balances when you try to operate it like a business. So it can't be operated exactly. You can use the same business-like principles. You learn early on in business that you can't borrow yourself out of debt. You can't spend money you don't have. You better realize that in government too. And of course, the state of Georgia's got to operate on a balanced budget, and you've got to have the money in, or you can't spend it. That's a good challenge. I better go. It was that way, but it's not. But fiscal responsibility and operating state government on a sound business-like basis was, I guess, one of my primary objectives. And then at that time, you had a real tough time building prisons in the state. And Carl was can relate to this. We had an overabundance of prisoners in our jails, and didn't have anywhere to put them. They were going to state taken off your hands, and we had about 12,000, almost 13,000 prisoners in the state system at the time I elected governor. And with the help of Carl and other members of the General Assembly, we were able to fund and build 24,000 new spaces while I was governor. Most of them been built in an 8-year period in the state of Georgia, and paid for them and funded them and put them in place. So when I left office, 36,000 spaces. Now there's been some additional spaces added, and not in the large numbers like we had over that 8-year period.
But you're under a federal mandate, didn't it?
Well, some of our, a couple of our prisons was under federal mandate to make some improvements. And we had to Reedsville and others, and Judge Alamo had put some restraints that cost the state millions of dollars because the federal government had got into our prison systems, and we were trying to get them back out too, and keep them out. But we had that basis, and so part of my platform was if I'm elected governor, will I believe in making prisoners work, and we came back to a program that would allow prisoners to be used out in the state again, where they hadn't been in places, and shared with local governments. And then education was our big, really our primary objective and responsibility and priority to improve education. And I always remember standing in the Capitol and going over my platform, particularly in education, and it ended up going in the new program that we had. What I said was that I felt like the students in Georgia ought to have at least a quality basic education. We didn't feel like we had a basic education anywhere in the state at that time, and that coined the phrase of the QBE, the program, and really the funding mechanism that's in place today. It wasn't designed to be in place today. It was designed to be improved and revisited periodically, but it has not been revisited as often as it should have been to keep it updated. But it was a good foundation to keep building off of. And of course, jobs for Georgians, that was another big priority in our campaign, that we wanted to try to make the kind of climate in our state available for people who want to come and invest here. And actually we had over 850,000 new jobs during that 8-year period, which still is a record for 8-year period. But again, that some windows of opportunity to be able to do that, because there's not that many opportunities out there now to be able to bring the number of jobs that we're able to bring. But we brought a lot of new jobs, and had a lot of help to do that in local communities, chambers of commerce all over the state, and the business community supporting the efforts too.
Common sense platform.
Well, we'd like to try to think that's what it was, and looking back.
No, I can remember your opponent slamming a jail door or something, and a lot of people shuddered at that. You know, it was not what people wanted to see. They wanted a platform like you all there, and I think that's it.
But he also jumped on a good jet wing or something.
There's a lot of fun commercials in that campaign. I didn't have to do that though.
Well, there was a point when momentum changed in that race. I use names. Bogan was expected to run first, and he did. Most of the political pundits around the Capitol and the media people thought that either probably Norman Underwood or Billy Lovett would run second. Jack Watson, who was a supporter and friend of Jimmy Carter's, and who had Jimmy Carter's support. But with all that against you, that momentum swing, and it was obvious that, can you pinpoint anything that would have turned that around for you? Was it the radio program?
I think there was a little commercial that we had on the radio program. And of course, as you know, we had a kind of a call-in talk-a-thon on the radio that had never been done before at the time. And we'd go out to WGST in Atlanta, and Bill Walker was our campaign PR person from Memphis. He came in, and he was a good commentator himself, and he was kind of helping put the thing together. And we would invite people all over the state to sponsor that program in their local communities. So local campaign groups would come together, raise enough money there to put the program on the local station. We had a station around the state that was carrying that program. But people would call in their questions, and I would talk about them and give them an answer. And I think people at work would tune in and listen to those things. And after we had several of those, where you could feel that little jingle that we had, Joe Frank Harris was the man, that the kids were all related to it. You go into a shopping center or where people might have been or congregated to hand out your cards, or invariably some child would come up to you and Joe Frank Harris is the man. And so I think if the kids were picking up on that, well, the parents probably were picking up on it too. And so that was the time, I guess, that we started getting momentum.
But we had 5 different versions of that.
Yeah,
I mean, to each little class of people, it was, country western, and you had a urban one, and then you had it was just really neat.
The FM station had a little highbrow one.
Elizabeth, did you ever get angry during that campaign?
All the time.
Could you tell me what you told my good friend Durwood McAllister after he said your husband had the charisma of a bowl of cold grits?
There's no truth.
Well, I said, it's nice when you put a little honey on it. You know, and then I was warming it up, put a little honey on it. Joe Frank really wasn't that kind of backslapping, happy-go-lucky, but it's just like some of the Japanese and the Japanese American Southeast Society was talking one evening about Joe Frank. He said, you might think he's a laid-back statesman here in Georgia, but when he's in Japan, he's aggressive. And I think that's the nut of him. I never dreamed when I met him that he would be the kind of politician he was, because he didn't have that kind of personality. But boy, when you put him turning loose on the campaign trail, there he went. And I saw a side of him, I thought, wow, he could go out and work that crowd, he could go out and do those kind of things. And, but basically, he was a very shy individual. But he was himself, and I don't think he ever changed that. But he fit his personality and the talents that the Lord gave him to the situations at hand. And I think that's what God requires of us to be what he needs us to be in the moments that he calls us to do it. And that's the way to get the job done.
I used to work with Durwood.
He's a great character.
And Durwood reversed himself at the end of the year. And he said that you were
I worked hard on it.
Did you? Good. Well, now we're down to the point where you're in the runoff with Mr. Gann. Wasn't even close. Wasn't close. You defeated him handily. And the thing that I appreciate most about you, Joe Frank, is your vision. And when you hit the governor's office on the 11th of January that year, you immediately began to do some things in this state that should have been done a long time ago. And you know, your growth strategies, your water management. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, at the time I was elected, we didn't really have a lot of control over our environment. And we had so much development going on all across the state, so we really needed to protect our water resources. And I always remember Novermber, who ended up being at the time he was the head of our Environmental Protection Agency, came to me and he ended up later being head of the Department of Natural Resources. But Leonard came to me and he said, we really don't know how much water we've got in the state. He said, we really don't know how much we're losing or how much we're taking off. And he said, we need to have, I forget what the amount was, but several thousands of dollars to have develop a water budget. He said, we need to determine where the water is and where it's coming in and where it's been taken out so we'll know how to manage what we've got. And it was during a short budget year, the first year I was in office, but we went ahead and got him started on that. And it kind of, I guess, was shocking and amazed all of us when we came back to that determination that we still, even today, we have an overabundance of water in Georgia, but it's not all in the right places. I mean, if we could go down in South Georgia, we got plenty of water and underground aquifer and all there that if we could ever pump it back north. I mean, you never run dry, but then politically you'll never be able to do that because of the farming, the agricultural industry, and things like that that's involved. Then in and around Atlanta, we determined then that we needed to have about 15 regional reservoirs and distributed around in areas and go in and start collecting the water there so it'd be available for distribution later on. And then Alabama got in the picture when we funded the first reservoir over in West Georgia and in Georgia, and that started water that we got going today, and it's been going ever since to prevent Georgia from building those regional reservoirs. And a lot of good ideas really started or at the beginning of it, but we carried it through on. But out of that, we developed the growth strategy study group that almost like our Education Review Commission that we had of educators and others and business community that came together and worked 24 months to develop rights of the streams and all those kind of things that developed at that time.
Well, with your permission, we'll take a short break because we are filming this for the archive. And Jerry needs to change his tape. Well, we had talked about your wasting very little time getting your administration wheels in motion. I would like to ask you, or recite to you a couple of three things earlier in your administration, get your reaction on that. First of all, you sponsored a bill in the legislature to create Martin Luther King holiday. It had never been presented before, as I recall, and it passed. And I always believed that you did that to jump that hurdle at the very beginning of your administration. Is that right?
Well, one of the motivating factors, because it was something that had to be considered. Almost like, I guess, the previous administration had been faced with a flag problem. That it was something that was not going away, and we need to be in step with the rest of the nation. And I think it was time that it be approached. Now, it was not very popular to deal with, as you know, at that time. I mean, we had to struggle with it, even with the members of the General Assembly, and get support to be successful with it. But looking back, I'm glad that we got it out of the way when we did, and interfered with a lot of other things. And really, it brought us a lot of harmony and support and help. That it wasn't a divisive element at all after that, because it worked well and got in place good, and I think that was the time for it.
And then you passed our first seatbelt law.
That was a good one.
The speaker did not
The
want
speaker has
that.
never supported the seatbelt law, and that created a friendship also with me and Paul Coverdale that remained until his passing, until his death. But Paul was the leading Republican of the Senate, and Paul, that was actually his bill that generated in the Senate that we were able to help support and ride on. That I think the seatbelt law affected, but we had a lot of good support from across the aisle. And I know John Isaacson in the House, who is now our senator. He was also a good friend, and probably agreed with about 95% of every initiative that we had at that time. And he was a leader of the Republican. Paul Coverdale was in the Senate, and we had a friendship and a relationship with him that was very effective for us. And Paul supported about 95% of everything we had over there too. So we had a good coalition of people that supported our initiative. But that was time. The only thing I guess regrets that I have about that is that we were unable to include pickup trucks, and I just barely got it passed for what we had in it. But I really do feel like, in looking back, that there's been a lot of lives saved because people were reminded of
Click it or ticket. Click it or ticket. Then you appointed Robert Benham to the Court of Appeals, the first African American to ever serve on that group, and he's now the Chief Justice. A very well qualified man.
That was another opportunity that we had. Of course, I had an opportunity to appeal also. Or actually, that's where I appointed him first and then appointed him over to the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, and then he was first black in both places. But we had some good opportunities to do some of the things that need to be done, and that was one of the things that should be done.
And Judge Beasley.
Yes, I had an opportunity to appoint the First Lady.
First Lady, serve on the Supreme Court.
Judge Benham, there's a little local thing on there. When Joe Frank first ran, he was a young attorney that was working for Davis there in the county, Judge Davis, and I don't really think he supported Joe Frank when we met. So this gives you a little insight into the man. He doesn't always look back and say, "What have you done for me?" He's always was trying to reach out and do something better for the state. And Judge Benham is a dear friend of ours, and we just appreciate what he.
Well, he must be a good jurist. He's he's the Chief Justice, and those.
Well, one thing I think I probably learned early in politics is that you don't, just because somebody does not support you today, that does not mean that they won't ever support you, because some of the best supporters I ended up with later, even people in the primary when they run for governor, a lot of people supported other candidates, but then they got on board in the runoff, and then some of them even came later, ended up being some of our best supporters and helpers, and so I've always felt like that if you disagree with somebody, don't be disagreeable about it, because you may need it tomorrow.
It's good political philosophy. One of the visionary things that I remember is your Georgia Research Consortium that you started at Georgia Tech and Georgia, and we were at Georgia State, Southern Tech,
And Emory. This was something that I think was timely too, because at that time, I don't know if you remember or not, but there was a lot of competition for microelectronics centers, and there was a big initiative to build a supercomputer for the whole United States that the University of Texas was competing for, and we could not really make the chase. And Dr. Pettit, from the president of Georgia Tech, and spent a lot of time we did work with him trying to compete with some of these initiatives and bring something to Georgia and high tech and in particular microelectronics. And we determined that if we were going to compete, then we had to have, well, number one, the Microelectronics Center at Georgia Tech, and the Bioscience Center at the University of Georgia, and a lot of other areas that we couldn't supply because we didn't have the people trained, or we didn't have the facilities to be able to train people and compete for these kind of projects. And so we came up with the Research Consortium. That was our title for it, and it was a funding mechanism that if the school would raise half of the money, then the state would try to join in with them and supply the other half. And Georgia Tech on the Microelectronics Center, it was designed to be about a $40 million project, and we were going to give them $10 million to start it out, and they were going to raise the next 10, and right off the bat they raised $20 million, and matched our 10. So we used I guess in that first round of funding, about $250 million, close to $250 million worth of new buildings and equipment and centers that we were able to put at Georgia Tech and University of Georgia, Southern Tech, and also the campus center that we participated in, $10 million worth at the Emory. The first time that ever happened in the state funding anything in private education, but we was able to come up with partnerships there and do that. But the Research Consortium was the foundation for the Research Alliance that Governor Miller brought in and made it a lot larger than what we had and a lot bigger, and it's continued on, but it was our beginnings of that in that area that I guess has lasted and continued to be productive.
Georgia has had many governors who touted their interest in education. And you came up with QBE, which, as you said, is still in existence today. Tell us how that came about and how you were able to fund it.
Well, I mentioned earlier that how the name came about, just through wording that I used in the press release and the Capitol press conference. We appointed after I was elected. That was one of the first things that I did. I kind of ran on the promise that if you elect me governor, I'll be governor the first day I enter office. I won't have to go through the on-job training period and learn how to do what's supposed to be done. We'll start learning the office. Well, that was one of the first resolutions that was sent to the General Assembly, was setting up what we call at the time the Education Review Commission. It was 35 to 60 people, as I remember, across the state, not all educators, from the business community and kind of across sections of Georgia, that we would select people to come together and really reinvent education for the whole state, and not take for granted anything we had in place, but look at what our needs might be and how we might be able to meet the objectives and be competitive with not only other states, but start improving here in Georgia. And then the teacher salaries were just ungodly low at the time too, and that was always a big factor, and people felt like, well, if you keep raising teacher salaries, you're just throwing more money at education and you're not really getting any guidelines or any improvement. And so out of that Education Review Commission, came, well, the bill was actually about 180, 90 pages thick. I mean, it looked like a serial book catalog. And I always remember the speaker. We tried to keep him informed as the committee would come in with their recommendations, and it met almost a 2-year period. And the media, as you know, started criticizing me. Well, all you're doing is meet, you haven't done anything yet. When are you going to introduce a bill? When are you going to do something about education? But we had to try to have some direction before we poured more money into it and try to improve it that way. And the Speaker, when he came into office, we sent the final copy of the Education Review Commission report, and it was going to be incorporated into a bill. Well, as he would do a lot of times, he would confront you on things that he maybe didn't understand, and do the same thing with Congressman with the proposed bill again, with George Donald. He walked in, had his coat over his shoulder, and cowboy hat in his hand, and he had the bill in his hand. I had a coffee table in my office about like this, and he threw that bill into the coffee table. He said, "If you think you're going to pass this bunch of trash," he said, "you got another frock coming." And I thought, well, here we go again. Not like seatbelt law. But he had certain parts of it that he didn't like or didn't understand. But what he didn't know is that we'd already organized a group of business people with the local Chamber of Commerce in line, and the Georgia Chamber of Commerce, and John Clinton, who was chairman of the Board of Bell South this time, agreed to be chairman of it. And he brought together a real high-caliber group of business people all the way across the state. And it was almost like a campaign to get elected for public office. They were going to local communities, telling them what we're going to do, and we're going to improve education. This is our plan to do it with. And it built up local support all over the state. The legislator came to Atlanta with folks back home saying, well, don't you vote against that? Don't you vote against that? Well, when it came up, it came up in the General Assembly. It was a House bill, and it was debated for hours. But it passed the House without a single negative vote. Now, I think people were afraid to vote against it. Went over to the Senate, and same process. It passed the Senate without a single negative vote. That big, thick bill. And then it went into the Conference Committee. Well, everybody else that got left out on either side, well, they had their amendments they tried to get inserted in the Conference Committee. And there were very few changes in the Conference Committee. It came back with approval of both bodies, the House and the Senate. And it passed again without a single negative vote. It's the only major bill that I can recall in my lifetime that has passed both houses and in the conference committees without a single negative vote. But we had that kind of mandate behind trying to do something with education. Now, we had improvements out of that process of over 1,100 schools across the state that we built new classrooms and some totally new schools. And we had during the 8 years I was governor, we had a 69% increase in teacher salary. Now, you've never had that before or since, where you've had that high percentage, but the revenue generated allowed us to be able to do that, and we made a real impact. Now, looking back, I guess the disappointment that I would express even today is all the money that we put in during my administration, all the money that Governor Miller put in during his administration, all the money that Governor Barnes put in during his administration, now during the Purdue administration, we still are way too low in our SAT and our comparison. And you wonder why. I mean, why haven't we been able to have quality enough instruction and be able to get the kind of productivity? But I guess if I had any idea of why we haven't yet, it's because these students still do not have the support in their homes, in their communities, that really challenge them that this is what you've got to do, and if you don't do it, this is going to be the results, and your penalty is going to have. And you have so many children are coming out of really single parent homes, some really with no parents at all. That's a part of the process that's in the total that we're having to compete with and for. And so we've got our work still cut out for us. We're going to have a challenge for many, many years to try to continue to improve, but we can't stop. It's so important. If we're going to be successful as a state and as a nation, and even as our communities across the state, we've got to keep doing something dramatic and something productive in education.
You think parent education would possibly be a solution?
Well, hopefully some of the parents that will be parents are coming through the system now that will have that determination. But again, until I guess we have and I guess that's within people's hearts, where they're going to have a change of heart to be able to have the home life and the atmosphere there that would be conducive to learning and training of those young students.
growth strategies. We mentioned that. It had tremendous results. In fact, it still has results. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, we actually was recognized on a national level, and my last year in office, I went to the convention of all the environmentalists across the state. They've got an association, and they presented Georgia with the largest award for being able to make the most progress in a short period of time in changing laws and improving laws to do something about the environment. But that was a good foundation, again, like QPE. I think we left a foundation in place, and it wasn't intended to be the fix-all forever. And you've got to keep it going back and improving and refining. And I'm not sure that we've had enough of that in recent years, particularly with the development and growth that we've had all across North Georgia. You see that where you go down, even in my own community, I live in Cartersville. I can't get out of my driveway in the morning or afternoon because of the traffic. And all of our communities have to contend with those kind of things. And traffic is a big problem for most of your even smaller cities across the state, and particularly large ones.
Wow.
Okay. Here.
Well, first of all, I want to make an observation and I want to ask a question of the subject. When you talk about your administration as government, you use the collective pronoun, we, much more frequently than you use the personal pronoun, I. That says a heck of a lot about you and the kind of administration you had. And I think that's highly commendable. Wish we could get more of that from politicians who tend to want to tout their own input into things. The question I want to raise is, if you were running for governor today, and you already have mentioned your concern about education, so I'm sure that would be part of it, but what sort of platform would you probably be touting?
Yeah, I think the same priorities exist today that has existed through previous administrations for many years. And I know when I was preparing to do my state address, we went back and reviewed some of the previous governors and what they said during that time. And their priorities, even back years and years ago, aligned a lot with our priorities at that time, and even the priorities that you need today. Of course, education has always been a high priority for everyone, and jobs and the economy in some way, that's always been a public safety, your jails and prisons and the judiciary, and providing them equipment too to be able to do an adequate job has always been foremost in people's minds. And there's another element that we'd have to deal with today that you didn't used to have to consider is technology and the kind of evolving that we have been going through in recent years and the improvements. And sometimes, I'm not sure it's always improvements, it sometimes adds another level of scrutiny and another cost because of technology and what it's brought to us. But we still have a lot of the same needs that we had years ago, and with the state continuing to grow and new people moving in, we've got transportation, that's, as I mentioned a moment ago, that's a big factor in everyone's mind, and it's going to cost multiple millions of dollars to address. And I would like to sit here today and say that you can address it by the amount of revenue that you're generating and bringing in. But then something that we did propose during my second term, I think really needs to be revisited. I'm not sure whether some of these other folks that serve as on assembly here with me today would agree with me. But people that are using up our roads in Georgia, I don't know what percentage of the state, used to be over a third, almost a half, were not Georgia residents. I mean, they're using our roads and we're paying for it. And then you look back at the price that the gas has been for the last several months, and you realize that we could add another few cents of tax in there to really make some improvements on our road. Now, we had what we call the GRIP program, the Governor's Road Improvement Program, still exists. It was a program that we started while I was governor build a 4 lanes and pavement all across the state. And I proposed at that time to raise the gasoline tax to 5 cents on the gallon, and was defeated. That was one of the things that I didn't win on in General Assembly. The Speaker was one of the real persons against it, and we were unable to do it. That's the last attempt that anyone's ever had to raise the fuel tax, but it wouldn't be that much, it wouldn't be that major, even in the budget today, if you'd add that other nickel. But then look at the amount of money that we have brought in over the last it was almost 15 years ago when I proposed that. And the amount of improvements that we could have had that we would have been paying for. So it's a need that's there, and it needs to be realistically looked at by whoever's in the position of leadership, and it's not going away.
You had some concerns about the environment. Your time, would protecting the environment be even a larger part of the platform?
Well, I think it's something that's on people's mind, that they got to be reassured that as part of the environment, like the eminent domain, that it's become a big factor in people's mind, that governments can go in and declare properties that something they want to build on or tear down and bring in other kinds of businesses in those places. And we had a court ruling in Massachusetts somewhere last year that has put that on everyone's minds. Well, we certainly don't want this to happen in our community. And but really, there's nothing about this time. Number one, I believe that helps the state address it. I don't know. I haven't looked at it that much. I don't know how it works or whether that's going to be the fix-all for it. But it's something that's going to remain, particularly in a growing economy. You're going to have needs to keep addressing the environment, make sure that you're proper with the kind of restraints and regulations that you have.
We've lived in Georgia now for over 40 years, and we've died Georgians. But we came down here from Maryland, and in Maryland, when they ran a slate for governor, it was a slate of about 4 people were as a team, whereas we don't, here everything is individual. What was your relationship with like the lieutenant governor, and how did you use him as a part of your team, as against, where they had up there, they had the controllers on the part of the team, and there was just they didn't all get elected sometimes, the whole team did. Some guy did and some guy didn't, but and the other question I have is, given your conservative background, thank goodness, what about, if you were starting politics today, would you be a Republican? And we see a lot of Democrats here in the state, the basis of the Republican Party.
I'll answer your last question first. A couple weeks ago, I got a call from, we were at a Mayo Clinic in our annual physical, and I called my message machine back home. I had 19 messages on it. I mean, everybody I tried to reach me, from the governor's office to the Georgia State University, and anybody that had any contact with Joe Frank Ashley called them and tried to run me down. I returned the call, and it was the White House, and they were looking for a prominent Democrat to serve on a committee with a prominent Republican that had a settlement coming up, and that was what the settlement called for, and they asked would I let them consider using my name for the prominent Democrat. And I had to tell the Ambassador Trade I was talking with, and I had to tell her that, well, I'm not sure that your credibility would be too good if you named me as a prominent Democrat, because the Democrats today are not like the Georgia Democrats that we used to be, and like I am. I said, I would have to identify myself today. And I said, I'm sure you can understand it because you're familiar with it. And I said, I guess I'm more of a Zell Miller Democrat than I am a regular Democrat, because I can't embrace the national agenda and what they're trying to do there. And but I guess if I had to make that decision to run, particularly in my own local county, if you're going to be successful, you better run as a Republican. You can't make it as a Democrat. So I'd probably be changing horses.
Question, sir?
Yeah, you had been using the we, which is wonderful to hear. And part of that we was you were working both sides of the aisle together. Why were you able to do that, and we do not seem to be able to do that today, either in the state or nationally? but especially in the state, what has happened to bipartisanship and the need to work together to get things done, or the thought that you don't have to work together any longer to get things
You
done?
know, my person, I guess it's my own personality, is that I've never felt like that you can get a whole lot done if you're the one that jumps out and brags about, well, look at me, or look at what I did, or I did this. I mean, if you got a group of people and they all think that we did this ourselves, then you're able to be successful. And even today, I probably don't, and won't ever get credit for a lot of good things our administration was able to do, because I didn't hold press conferences and brag about what I'm doing. And it just didn't, my thought process didn't generate the I feeling, I guess. You know, I felt like, well, I'm here because the people allowed me to be here. I'm successful because I've got a good staff around me that's able to generate these ideas and be able to carry out the thoughts and the vision I might have for the state. And so I'm glad, John, that you correct that. I would hate for you to think that I went up to the name and said, well, I did this, I did that, because it was a we and a group of folks. And I don't understand why our leaders today can't understand that if you're going to be able to be successful in anything, well, then you got to reach across the aisle and bring the opposition in, let them share. And I guess too, instead of trying to lord up your ideas over people, I try to help bring together folks in a consensus. You might not get 100% of what you wanted, but then you get over 50, you've been successful.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can come back maybe later and add a little more to it if it's something of necessary, promise or necessary. But today it seems like that people get locked into, well, this is what I want to do, and if you can't get with me on it, well, I'm going to do it without you and do it in spite of you, and it creates a lot of animosity and a lot of ill feelings and lack of harmony within the process. But if our nation's ever going to succeed, and our state, even local government, I think you got to have a lot of dedicated people being willing to serve, and it's a lot harder to serve today than it's ever been because of the attitudes of people and their mean spirit and caustic feelings that they have. But they've got to be able to work together, to realize, well, we're in this on behalf of what's best for our nation, our local governments, our state, and do away with some of the personal agendas that people have generated.
Thank you.
All right, Franklin.
One of the most obvious things from today is so admirable about both you, Governor, and the First Lady, is you have a very devout Christianity of love. And I say that because, I mean, you speak about the Lord openly, and it is not contrived. Okay, that's very clear. What do you think about the Christianity of hate today? And I think you know what I'm talking about. Can you comment on that? Because obviously your support for the King holiday is a religion of love. It's a Christianity of love, and not what so many people I think today have turned into a Christianity of hate. Could you comment on that?
Well, I dealt with it. I guess some of the toughest time I had to go was really, at that time they called them the religious right, because it was
Right.
folks that had come together and they had their own agenda. And the thing I think that's wrong with some of the groups that they've organized is that they've got 8 or 9, 10 points to their agenda, and you've got to support all 10 of them, or they're not going to support you.
Right.
And they're going to call your hand on it. And I got some of the worst hate mail and caustic mail that I had while I was governor because of number one, my stand on abortion. I was not for it and didn't support it, but I took the position that I felt like that it was because of rape or incest that it ought to be considered. Well, because I wasn't totally against any kind of abortion whatsoever. Well, I was an outcast.
Right.
And those people, I mean, they could really eat you up alive,
Right.
and they did. But it was the kind of thing, I guess, that reminded us that we needed to do a whole lot more praying ourselves. And again, I guess some of the most encouraging messages I got while I was governor was to get postcards sometimes on like on Tuesday, Wednesday, dear Governor Harris, our Sunday school class prayed for you last Sunday. And you realize, well, there are people out there that you ask folks to support you with their prayers and advice, and they were praying for you. And that's something that, well, that's what generated the commitment that Elizabeth had early on, where we wanted to do and where we wanted to be, was through our own family altar. Because after we married, we decided that we were going to pray together in our home every day. And I've shared this story with you because I've shared it several times in the class at Georgia State University. People ask the question, well, how'd you get into politics? And I'll go back and tell them why. Sure. And I talk about that family altar. And one lady raised her hand one day and she said, well, Governor Harris, where did you build that family altar in the mansion? I talked about, well, we had the family altar, we get together and pray in the mansion, and went around the world where we were every night. We were going to pray together. And well, where did you build that family altar in the mansion? I had to describe to her, and in her mind, she thought it was something that you constructed and kneel down in front of. That you make that family altar at the foot of your bed, or in the closet, bathroom, or in your office desk, or wherever. It's just a matter of just saying, well, this is the place that we're going to pray together. But that family time and that prayer time has been very valuable to not only to Elizabeth and to our marriage and our relationship. It's been very valuable to deal with matters just like you mentioned here. I had a straight line to the mansion while I was governor. And let me share this with you too. I think the governor's office is one of the most loneliest place that you can ever be, because you're making a major decision that's going to affect people's lives almost every 15 minutes. People that are coming in and requesting something, they make a decision to make, well, I'll do this or I won't do that. Well, then that's going to affect people's lives. And sometimes you have some major decisions coming in, or you have a general assembly that could get together on the budget and lightning would strike the Capitol and give somebody an idea where we get off this standoff. I pick up that straight line to the mansion. I call Elizabeth and say, well, pray about this or pray about that. Well, she had these little yellow stick-on tags that you write things on her mirror in her dressing room. Well, she had a lot of those stick-ons on there. Judge, I'll share this with you. Right at the top of that, there were two people that stayed up there till one of them was the Attorney General, Mike Powers, and the other one was Bill Shipp. They were all over the Bill Shipp, and you know Bill well. And I told him this too personally. He has probably the greatest skill to be able to take accurate information and distort it. I mean, he'd come to the Capitol, we'd have press conferences, and we'd have all the numbers printed out and handed to him. And you'd read his editorials, and before he'd write the paper, it's almost like, well, he never attended anything, and didn't know what the numbers were, because he couldn't use accurate information to make his point. But he was always at the top of the list.
Other questions? Sir?
Governor, take us back to the days of Tom Murphy for a few minutes. As strictly as an observer, he functioned as a dictator who would not abide any opposition. And you were in the legislature in his day. He was speaker for more than 20 years. And then you were governor in his day. What kind of a relationship did you have with him, and how were you able to achieve it?
My earlier years in General Assembly, through the appropriation process, I generated the relationship that I had with the Speaker, and he trusted me because I did try to learn the numbers and try to understand what was going on. And when he had questions, well, he would call me in. He'd meet with people that would come to him about funding requests. Well, he would call me in. I'll say this about him. He probably was one of the most sensitive people and had as good a heart as anybody that you've ever dealt with. I mean, you could go in there, regardless of what your needs might have been, and if he felt like there was a need there, I mean, he would climb the highest mountain to try to alleviate that pain and suffering or try to address that problem. But then he would never, that image would never come out when he would be interviewed by the press or even in the writing of the press, because he presented a tough guy, cowboy style. I always had that cowboy hat, you know. And
in a pickup truck.
Yeah, that was the image, and that's what he enjoyed, that cigar. I mean, they quit letting him light it, he still shoved it in his mouth and chew on it. But my relationship with him was actually very cordial until I got elected governor. And then it was very tested because, number one, he didn't agree with my chief of staff that I kept, or Tom Perdue. He never liked Tom Perdue, and I kept him because he was in place and he had worked with Governor Busby, and I didn't have to go through a retraining time for someone else and make mistakes and knew what needed to be done. Now, Tom Perdue was tough also, but he was a good beginning of our administration and kept a lot. We figured he didn't like him, didn't trust him, didn't want anything to do with him. That created a little bit of separation. Then there were 2 or 3 appointments that came on, one judicial appointment. He had a friend that, a judge, that this is the person that you're going to name. I didn't name him. And that didn't help matters at all. And then he took issue with me on some of the legislative agendas, proposals that I had from QBE on down that came in, on the building of the Georgia Dome. That was another good one that came in after. Well, we were about to lose the power. Jacksonville had made a proposal for them to move down there, and Rankin Smith didn't have any contract to keep them in line at all. And a group of business people came to me from the Congress Senate Party, John Atwell was chairman at the time, and said, we're going to have to do something to accommodate the Falcons to keep them in Atlanta, or either we're going to lose them and going to lose all the future events that we might be able to have because we don't have a proper stadium or place to even entertain. And so we brought together Chamber of Commerce people and folks from business in Georgia Tech and the University of Georgia and others that anybody might have an interest in the stadium. They met in my office and we determined that there was a need there, enough support to try to look into it, that we ought to at least have a study made. And so I got our Office of Planning and Budget, had the party's government, I can't remember what the exact amount was, but we hired a firm to come in and $100,000 to do an initial study and see if it could be warranted. Well, the study came back very positive, that enough business generated enough days of use to be able to have a dome stadium. And then in the back of my mind, I'll share this with you too, we had already approached Peter Grant to come to Georgia and do one of his crusades. And we got refused because you don't have a proper facility for the size of the crusade to have in Atlanta. So that was really, I guess, one of the initiating factors in my mind, that if we can build a stadium and the Falcons pay for it, Billy Graham can come. Do some of these other things. Well, after the study came in, well, there's a lot of people prospecting about what it ought to be built on the outside of the perimeter, it ought to be built somewhere. Everybody had in mind where it ought to be built. And our proposal was that it should be built in conjunction with the Congress Center that's already there, because we needed additional civic space and needed that to finish off that complex and to protect the investment that we already had. The speaker found out about what we shared with him, what the study was bringing back, and where we want to locate it. At that time, the railroad owned that property where the stadium was built. It was called the Railroad Gulch. It was covered up in kudzu and done an old gas generator plant there, so that was smoke that's still located there. And he bounced into my office and he said, about like he did on the QBE bill, he said, if you think you're going to build that stadium over in that gulch, he said, it'll be over my dead body. He said, it ain't going to be located over there. If you build one, it's not going to be there. And he just turned around the world and went out. Well, I mean, that kind of sets you thinking about now how we're going to go about this thing. Well, it took about 2 years longer to get it on the ground than it should have had, because we had to incorporate the city of Atlanta, the funding mechanism. We use the same revenue generating mechanism to the tourism that we use for the Democratic Convention to bring in and pay for it. It was already in place, and so you had to incorporate the city of Atlanta and the county of Fulton, because they had to collect the money. And the state only has a little over $10 million in the site. And that has paid for itself, and it's going to pay for itself a lot earlier than was anticipated. And the news media in Atlanta really prosecuted me because the total cost of it at the time was about $225 million, I think, when we built it initially. And they portrayed that as being $225 million of tax dollars that we were putting in it. But there was an innovative financial mechanism that we used that we bought the property and used bonds for the balance of it, had a contract with the Falcons to repay it, rent it in total. And before they can leave, I mean, that's got to be done, and which they've done, and it's generated a lot more than that too, and even brought the 2 Super Bowls that we've had, and the Final Four, and all the Crusade conventions, but the highest attendance that had been in that dome for any event was the Billy Graham Crusade. And so our prayers were answered there, and I look back with a lot of satisfaction realizing we were able to accomplish not only keeping the Falcons, but we had a crusade.
One final question.
Can I say something?
Certainly, Judge.
I haven't had an opportunity to do this for 21 plus years. I won't have another opportunity to do it. If you'll indulge me just a moment, I'd like to tell you about a personal experience with this man.
Judge, would you mind identifying yourself? I'm not sure.
My name is Kenneth Kilpatrick. I live in Union County now. I lived the first 65 years of my life in Clayton County, Forest Park, Jonesboro. The same day that Governor Harris Carlton was sworn in House of Representatives, I was sworn in Georgia Senate. I was 30 years old. Didn't really know where the bathroom was the first day I went in. That's how green you can be. And so I served a couple of terms in the Senate, later appointed by Governor Carter to the State Board of Education. I served 7 years on that. There came a vacancy in our judicial circuit in 1985. And I decided that I would attempt to get the appointment as a Superior Court judge. So I had some help, and some excellent help in obtaining the appointment. But I also had a lot of opposition. There were 4 people seeking it, some of which had a much closer relation to the governor than did I. Well, he had been elected governor, just as he said here. His main opposition was Bo Ginn. Guess who had been Bo Ginn's campaign manager in Clayton County? Me. He appointed me to the bench. Now, you've heard it said here that he was a man that did not hold grudges, that he did not. I'll tell you what he's got. He's got integrity. And you're going to go to the polls next Tuesday, folks. Elect integrity. Look for that in the people that you vote for, first, last, and always. I've told him a little while ago, I hadn't seen him in a while, how much I appreciated the 20 years that I was able to serve as Superior Court judge. And I wouldn't have been able to serve at that time, not a moment of it, had it not been for him. So, yeah, I'm biased. I'm prejudiced. Let's face it, you know, all judges who receive an appointment always carry the banner of the official that appointed them. But there's more to it than that. I wouldn't take your time, and I wouldn't spend my time right now telling you about this. He had integrity that you would not believe in conducting himself personally and professionally as governor. So And I get a little emotional about that. It's my life. It's what I did. And guess what? My wife and I decided. I had been in the banking business. I'd been president of a bank for 10 or 12 years. I'd been in the Georgia Senate. I'd been on the State Board of Education. I'd practiced law for many years. We knew when I was appointed to the Superior Court bench that I was at last where God would have me to be. All the experiences I'd had before that made me a better judge, I like to think. And there were many times, Governor, when on the bench this thought would come to me. Be the kind of judge that Governor Harris wanted you to be when he appointed you. I hope I have. I've fallen short, I'm sure, many times, but I'll never get this opportunity again to publicly thank you. And Martha and I appreciate that so much. Thank you.
Let me say I'm honored that you're here today. Good to see you again. I appreciate you saying that, but you brought out a point that I think I tried to make earlier. That you don't hold grudges on people, and then when you look folks to a point, I never would ask for my staff if someone had been a contributor of mine, or whether it's Republican or Democrat, we would try to find out what geographic location he's coming from so you comply by where the law would call for you to live, to serve, and then make a decision based on who had the best qualification, but we felt like had the background and ability and to put it together. That you probably, if you remember when I swore you in, I always tried to make the point that judges and people that were serving in the court system was sacred appointments, because decisions that you made would change people's lives forever and their families. I mean, that's a tough spot. That was probably one of our greatest prayerful decisions when we have judicial appointments to make. And I would personally interview all the finalists, all four of those people, and then you bring them in and we would talk to them and interview them and pray about it. And sometimes it was a tough decision because they were most of the time almost equal as far as their background experience, and then they'd make a good presentation when you come to the governor's office. I would never talk to them about their legal background, or I'm not a lawyer. And that was one of the first, the two most questions I had asked when I ran to start with the governor was, are you a lawyer and do you believe in capital punishment? And when I say, no, I'm not a lawyer, and yes, I believe in capital punishment, well, you see people who leave, you smile. Glad you're not another one of those lawyers. But still, I wouldn't ask legal questions, but I would ask questions about their background and their church attendance and their families. And usually if somebody's a good family man that attended church regularly and was involved in the community, well, they would get elevated a little higher on the list. But thank you for serving and accepting that appointment. And I'm honored that I had the opportunity to make that appointment.
Governor, for the benefit of us gathered here this afternoon and for future generations who view this hopefully as a part of their academic work, if I ask you to tell me the most important things you did while governor, what would you say?
Well, I'm not sure I could single it out and pick out particular items. I guess I get the most satisfaction out of looking back and realizing that our prayers were answered. The Lord opened up the doors. He didn't know me to be governor, but He gave me the physical strength and ability to be able to be at the right place at the right time, and motivated people to support me and enable me to be in that position. And so I'd have to give the Lord credit for the opportunity I had to serve there, and just be thankful that people of Georgia were willing to accept me, and that we've had an opportunity to have a little input, I guess, in
lot, and there are many things that we have not mentioned today. Bring the convention here. The Olympics, the role you play in the Olympics. So maybe someday in the future you'll come back and we can talk about that. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.